look at SMB, they're smaller organizations, much more price sensitive in many cases, fewer buyers. They're expecting that you're going to move quickly or as quickly as they do or want to. How do I do things faster, better, cheaper? There's just less steps. With the enterprise, the big thing that I think some salespeople maybe underestimate is the level of risk, because it's not like those larger companies can just turn very quickly and pivot and just say, now we're not going to go in that direction, right? They're making decisions, maybe in some cases 9, 12, maybe even 18 months, 24 months ahead when they actually want it to take effect. We see that challenge moving from SMB into the enterprise.
Welcome to Growth Decoded by MarketStar. My name is Paul Grant. Thrilled to be here with Paul Williams. Paul, it's really great to have you join us and be with us today. Atlassian's enterprise pivot has been something fascinating to follow and watch. If you would, Paul, just tell us a little bit about your role, your experience in leading enterprise sales teams and sales throughout your career.
Thanks for having me, Paul. I definitely appreciate it. And hello, everybody out there. I've been in enterprise sales for quite some time. Recently joined Atlassian the last 3.5 years. My role at Atlassian now is specifically around an area called enterprise strategy planning, which connects the strategy to the work that actually gets done in organizations. So specifically, when you look at portfolio leaders or folks that are kind of basically placing their bets on where they're going to invest their time and effort, and be able to track the outcome of the work that actually is getting done.
Paul, I'll start with the first question, and that's really, in your experience, how have these dynamics shifted your team's go-to-market priorities over the last 2 or 3 years?
So I think just like a lot of companies, right, they start out as product-led organizations. Atlassian started out that way, but in the last 3.5 years, we've started an enterprise solution. So specifically to focus on capturing more of the enterprise market. And really, the biggest pivot was how we actually engage the customers, but it was also a lot of things like internally in our own organizations. So they have strategic accounts, enterprise accounts, mid-market, and SMB. And we as an overlay team, we're kind of servicing all of them, right? To your point, a lot more decision makers, longer sales cycles. You had to account for that when you're forecasting opportunities, and how you actually quote the product, how you actually engage in demos. It's really a kind of a big fundamental shift, and really a different expectation that needs to be set internally. And so that was, I think, kind of some of the initial challenge. Now, 3.5 years later, the company is really kind of executing against that model. And what we find is that, as I mentioned, we really put people in those roles specifically to focus on the SMB model or SMB market, because the motion is quite different from where we are. And really what kind of pulled us along there was really our customers, right? We started to see that we were actually moving up market sort of naturally, and that sort of forced the change to some degrees. And so we had to set a new expectation with our customers and how we would engage with them, but we also had to set new expectations inside the organization as far as how we would actually operate as an organization.
Paul, if you compare kind of enterprise expectations of today with your time at Microsoft or IBM, obviously, very large scale enterprise sales organizations inside of those organizations, what feels fundamentally different or new, comparing and contrasting, your experience there to what you're driving today at Atlassian?
There are companies that I think moved into the enterprise much earlier and sooner, especially IBM. We really look at like what IBM and how they're structured from a sales perspective. It's very similar to the way that Microsoft is, very similar to the way maybe even like an SAP or some of these other larger enterprise companies are organized. And there's a reason for that. Typically tends to work. But we weren't necessarily beholden to that because we're a software native company, a bit more nimble, so we could actually create processes that work for us. It's good because there's a lot of process at those companies, but that also is a bit more rigidity in some cases. And we don't necessarily have that here, right, at Atlassian, which is somewhat liberating, frankly, from the aspect of being able to kind of forge ahead in ways that we think we need to that work for us.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And I think that nimble nature, being able to chart your own course, especially as market dynamics change. I mean, you and I both know, and we see it time and time again, that even inside of enterprise sales motions, the dynamics change dramatically. And even some of those legacy playbooks and or processes that were developed and were rigid over time have been disrupted. Obviously, we've had to align with how customers buy and approach buying today, and that's changed a lot.
Yeah, well, I think that it's being driven a lot right now from AI. That's changing everything, right? It's changing the sales models. It's changing how customers interact with us and what the expectations are. And so we've seen that has been a major shift in disrupting models, and specifically, I think, sales models. It's really going to disrupt, I think, how companies engage with each other moving forward, right? With AI on both sides of that equation. So it's going to get really interesting for the next few years.
You and I had chatted a little bit about this, but it was interesting in some of the data that we looked at. 40% of buyers here in the recent year versus somewhere around a mid-20s number, even 2 years back, are self-serving, utilizing AI tools and technology they have at their fingertips. And what a swift change that has been, to your point. And then to think about what lays ahead of us relative to purchasing habits, consideration criteria for large organizations. It's fascinating to think about what the future might look like there as well.
Yeah, well, and I think we none of us really know, which is the other thing. So that makes things even more interesting, right? I think we have some ideas and everyone has some thoughts, but I don't think we would have anticipated, 2 years ago, how fast we moved in the last 2 years to where we are now. So I think the expectation probably is and should be that we're going to continue to change at this rate, if not faster. So what does that mean, and how do you have an organization that can be nimble enough to take advantage of how that plays out in the market, and how we can leverage that to either garner additional market share, serve your customers better, or in a different way that might be unique to your competitors.
Maybe even a great segue into the next topic that we wanted to tackle here is structural differences, sales motion differences between SMB and enterprise. And tell me a little bit about what you've seen in your past, or maybe what you've experienced even recently.
The same playbook doesn't necessarily matter or doesn't necessarily apply, right? When you look at SMB, they're smaller organizations, much more price sensitive in many cases, fewer buyers. The whole alignment and how you actually engage is just different, right? Because you have a different set of expectations, as does the customer, right? They're expecting that you're going to move quickly or as quickly as they do or want to. And even though they have really the same challenges, it's a matter of scale, right? How do I do things faster, better, cheaper? And how do I, garner some kind of an edge so that I can, differentiate myself in a specific market? So they all have those challenges, but where it gets down to is since there are fewer decision makers from a sales aspect, what we find is that we can get access to people that actually can make the decision much more quickly. There's just less steps. With the enterprise, it's, as you mentioned, right, there's anywhere from 11 to 16 people, and it really depends. Like, just when you think you're done selling to people, like, it starts again with a different group, right, or somebody else, or there's different stakeholders. So you have to really you have to run almost like multiple types of sales campaigns with different people at different levels. So the altitude of your messaging has to change potentially, and depending on who you're talking to. You also have to show value at each step of the way, because typically when these companies make a move, larger companies, it involves a significant, usually, amount of money, right? First of all, big investment in time. And not only that, the big thing that I think some salespeople maybe underestimate is the level of risk, because making a change to them it can be risky, because it's not like those larger companies can just turn very quickly and pivot and just say, now we're not going to go in that direction, right? Because it took so long to get there they're making decisions, maybe in some cases 9, 12, maybe even 18 months, 24 months ahead when they actually want it to take effect. So they're looking maybe in some cases further ahead because they have to, based on their size and the time it will take to either implement change in the organization that needs to take place to adopt whatever technology that they're moving towards or whatever. In smaller companies, because there's fewer people, they can kind of pivot much more quickly, right? And so there's just a huge amount of factors. So we have seen that in frankly every organization that I've been in, and Atlassian really is no exception when it comes to that. We see that same type of challenge when moving from SMB into the enterprise.
Sounds like you're at the helm. You're charting a good course for the organization there at Atlassian, Paul. It's neat to see. Tell us a little bit about the signals that helped you chart that course or make a decision to say, all right, it's time to really move up market and do so expediently or whatever that may have looked like.
It depends on what we're selling, right? Because there's different products. There's some products that still have more of a flywheel type of motion, right? And they're still sold in that manner. Specifically, what I'm responsible for has always kind of been more of a higher level sale. So it was interesting, right? Because we have like more of a product-led company, and then with the acquisition of the particular product line, we're selling at a higher level. So it's just a different type of motion that we had to all kind of get used to. So the signals in our case specifically were already there, right? We know that people of a certain level are the people that have the kind of challenges that we're solving for. So we always knew that we needed to go there. But when you start to talk about like some products, again, are sold, if they're sold or maybe like at a developer level or whatever, what Atlassian has started to do is that we started to kind of complete that picture, because we know that at some point executives are going to consume something that was something that a developer was building, right? Or they're going to have to sell it, or they're going to have to consume it in some kind of a way. So what we found is that we started to fill in kind of those gaps, right? And we have this thing that we call like system of work, essentially, is what we've kind of named it. And really at a high level, it's kind of like our narrative and philosophy on how organizations actually work today. And so that inherently kind of starts at, there's people that do the work kind of at the element level, but there's people higher up that set that strategy for how people, what are they going to work on? How are they going to work on it? How are we going to measure that, whether they've been successful or whether we're being successful or not, if the bets that we're placing in these areas are actually paying off. So it was like a natural kind of motion, really, in a lot of ways, to move up that chain. It was sort of a natural progression. And that's what's kind of exciting, I think, about what we're doing here, is that if we can kind of solve for that, we already have like elements that we're super solid at, that we've been doing for many, many years and providing value to our customers. And now it's more of a pivot to how can we kind of move up level and satisfy that need for each level in an organization up to the highest levels. And we have to prove the value. And I think that we need to come prepared with better ROI calculation, what we call a business value assessment sort of approach, and meet the customers where they are, and then show the value of actually, completing that picture with additional pieces along the way. And so it's not just like a pivot and all of a sudden you start selling it to enterprise. I think it has to be an evolutionary kind of a thing where you add value, where customers can see that, hey, by doing this makes more sense, and I can get people higher up in the organization to pay attention to this versus, this is a tool, whether I have, a red tool or a blue tool, it's still a tool. So what does it actually mean to your organization? What value does it actually, bring to your organization in conjunction with other things? That's the value statement.
Thanks for sharing those insights. One of the other things that obviously is a stark contrast from more of an SMB sales motion to an enterprise sales motion is that of the procurement element, right? And selling through a multi-threaded procurement type process always becomes part of enterprise selling versus a versus an SMB sell. Now, what are some of the tips and tricks that you have honed in on with your teams to navigate that procurement buying cycle and environment?
Yeah, yeah, I'm smiling because it's everyone's favorite subject, right? As a salesperson is, dealing with procurement. Yeah, that's my favorite part, right? And where their job is really to kind of commoditize what you're doing, right? And so that's where I think, again, the value selling comes in, working closely with your sponsor to understand what are the outcomes that the company's trying to drive towards, right? So you always start with the outcomes. So if you start with that, then you can build value. You can understand, the risk characteristics of the company, how they actually buy, right? Understanding that process. So we've implemented things like mutual action plans and things like that, where all along the process we ask, okay, how does this work? If we're successful here, then who else needs to sign this? Who else needs to be involved? Who else needs to see it along the way to get their buy-in? I remember I did a transaction with a customer. Did a multi-year deal. When we did the 1-year deal, the transaction was very different, right, from a 3-year deal, and it changed within that 1 year. And we had to learn it together with our sponsor to actually what that process was like. So it's a lot of communication. It's a lot of showing value along the way. So what we did is we showed like what the business as usual case would be. We showed what the value is. And then also too is we engaged procurement early, which may sound counterintuitive. You engage them early and you start to talk to them. So they actually helped me get introduced into this customer. And so I knew who the procurement person was. And I asked him what the process was, right? And I said, well, okay, what's the expectation you have of us? What do we need to do? We knew exactly what was going to happen, and they walked us through it, and they communicated. So we had to continue to make sure that line of communication was open along the way all the time so that we could be updated. And that in of itself just reduced all the real friction or the guesswork of me asking the sales rep, hey, when's this going to happen? I don't know. I think maybe on Tuesday, right? So like we knew what needed to happen, and we knew where we were in each step of the way. Ask specific questions about how it actually works, and make sure pressure test that a little bit to make sure that they actually understand it, and then document the steps, and then back into a timeline of like, okay, if we want to execute it by this time, here are the things that need to happen by when. You do that, it removes all the conjecture out of it. It's all good.
Brilliant advice, Paul. I love it. And we here at MarketStar, I would say, more often than not, are buying through procurement cycles as well, and through our procurement partners. And I would just echo and underscore the part of building that relationship and ensuring that you have advocacy there, but more importantly, you understand, the outcomes, what they're trying to drive to, and it certainly can accelerate growth over time to have those relationships versus looking at it as just a rite of passage to get to a decision maker.
Well, and the other thing that is really interesting about that is it removes the leverage that procurement has at the end to say, now I want an additional discount out of the blue, which kind of, throws a wrench in the gears, affects the profitability model of whatever you built with your CFO and everybody else, right? It's because we know what the value is. They've agreed that they understand what that is. That makes things a lot easier as well.
Thanks, Paul. Appreciate those insights. Let's pivot a little bit. You've had a really great year at Atlassian. I think you shared with me some high-level numbers of 40% year-on-year ARR growth. You've driven top-line revenue up 20% year-on-year. I mean, really some strong growth numbers that you've put up. Talk to us a little bit about what are some of the repeatable elements of your enterprise playbook that have allowed you to see success the way you have so far this year.
I think if you start with the outcomes first, work backwards from there, and then quantify the value of doing that, right? So if they want to, implement a certain piece of software, why is it that they want to do that? What are they doing today? And what is their expected outcome, right? So if the customer's trying to solve something that is not economically feasible or it's just not the right thing, let's figure that out early and move on and recommend maybe a different approach. Or engage and then start to use like the action plans and those sorts of things so that we kind of keep aligned. I mean, you almost have to manage it like a project with all the different equations at the enterprise level, of course, right? When you're talking about that, where you have to like, okay, so when do we actually agree mutually with the sponsor? When do we go and get procurement involved? Or do we need to talk to the security team? When do we need to do that? What makes sense? Who are the stakeholders? What do they care about, right? Those kinds of things. And then what are they? How are they going to evaluate if they see value in the solution, right? So you need to understand all of those things to be able to put together something that's meaningful and valuable. We're actually building something else called I call it a maturity model. It's essentially kind of meeting customers where they are, so you kind of score them and understand like, okay, so are they even ready to take something like this on? What are the gaps? So we can identify that early so we don't have a mismatch down the road when we've spent 2 or 3 months together. It's always people, process, and technology. The technology and the process are easy, right? You hire a consultant or your process, that's easy. Somebody can make that for you. But the people in the technology is easy, right? You can buy it, right? But they should never buy tools that are going to solve a process problem or solve a people problem, right? And so you have to have all of those things working together. But the hardest part is always the people. So you have to make sure that is the organization ready for what they're going to take on? Can they actually absorb it at this particular time? And then what are the people's expectations have? Because if there's a misalignment there, projects will absolutely fail, 100%. So we need to make sure those things are in alignment. So we spend some time on that to make sure that we kind of are pressure testing that with the sponsor and making sure that we're all in alignment, that's going to be the right thing for the organization. And when we do that, we typically run into many fewer issues, and you can usually execute pretty smoothly at that point because then they have their buy-in.
A lot of things you unpacked there that you and I share in common that we were both aligned on. More than just our first names that we align on.
That's right. The Paul and Paul show.
Hey, Paul, one other thing that you shared with me that was fascinating is, in your journey here, as you've moved up market, you've done a great job of doubling the ACV. I think most of us would expect naturally that, yes, if you move up market, you're going to see larger deals. But we also see here at MarketStar anyway, we see some of these SMB, small business pivots, mid-market pivots to enterprise stall out when people just focus on, well, we're just going to go sell larger deals, forget about everything else. What did you do specifically? What were some of the things that were unique to your strategy that allowed you to actually realize that increased ACV on your enterprise business today?
You're 100% right. You should just not expect that automatically your ACV is just going to go up because you're selling to enterprises, right? Because what will happen in many cases if you don't build the value early, you'll get relegated to just a small pilot, right? And then you're going to have to really, and if you have the right types of products that can actually land and expand, and that maybe that's okay. But also too is you have to kind of build that into your model, right? So you have to understand that we might not see something now for like another year, or maybe it's 6 months, or whatever it is. So you have to factor that in with your financial models, right? All of that stuff, right? So that's very important to understand. And in many cases, because companies, if they are large and they are starting to try to pivot, it takes a little longer. Sometimes the value that they're going to get, they can't just they just want to dip their toe in the water in some cases, right? But you try to land with a more critical mass that is enough to show the value, because if you land too small, it's never going to be significant enough that it's going to show that value.
All right. One last question. What's one thing that really provided you acceleration in your enterprise growth journey?
I guess I will answer that to say that there isn't one thing, right? Is maybe the answer. You have to do all of these things in order for it to be successful, right? But I think the biggest thing, maybe the most important thing out of it is really making sure that you just align with the outcome that the customer is trying to drive towards. And really, and not only that, is understand their business so that you can speak intelligently about the problems that they're having and how, whatever it is that you're selling, right, will actually help them address the challenge that they're facing, right? I mean, it sounds like a basic thing, but it is in the enterprise. You have to get really good at delivering a common theme in the message of how you can help them, but you have to dial that in to the different people that you're speaking with based on their role, their job function, and what's important to them, right? As far as a metric, and it could be even a personal metric that they have or something else, right? That is how they actually may be measured in an organization. You can't forget that part either. It's simple, but it can be complex, but you have to do that. And if you do that, then that's what we've seen. That drives the largest deals that we do. And it forms long-term relationship.
That really resonates, Paul. Let's talk about one more maybe topic here. If you thought about kind of non-negotiables relative to the enterprise playbook, and especially as it relates to migrating from SMB into enterprise, what do you think those things are?
You have to change the orientation from a product sort of a mindset. We have to understand, like, what is the expectation that the customer has? What's the outcome that they're trying to drive to? And you're selling outcomes, not necessarily a product. And then proving value, that's a non-negotiable. If you're not proving value, typically enterprise customers, it's always an alternative for them. And when I say proven value, it's before the sale, it's during the sale, and it's after the sale. Because the other thing that happens in a lot of these larger enterprises is that they change personnel, right? People move in the organization. So where you started with somebody, that person may now be in a different group, on a different project. So you have to ensure that the legacy that you're leaving there is, hey, this is the value that it brings. So wherever it steps into that, next slot, understands why they made the decision before them to go in a certain direction.
Yeah, I think those are really good, and I like the value throughout the entire buying process, right? Before, during, after. And I think you hit it on the head. We see that all the time as well. People move inside those organizations. They may move from a business owner to a procurement contact, vice versa. I mean, they may move into a senior level role where they have much more decision-making authority, and hopefully you've stamped the value crisply for them where they want to come back to the table and have those conversations. What's your best advice for CROs, CXOs, go-to-market leaders, as they're about to take kind of their first big step or swing into the world of enterprise?
The first thing is just listen, and listen to your customers and spend some time with them. I think a lot of leaders don't necessarily get out and about and out with their customers and hear things firsthand, right? And I think that's important, and I think it sends a message too that you actually care from a customer standpoint. So go out and spend time, whether it's like a listening tour, whatever it is, with not only with the customers and also to your people. Because what you'll find is that they have insights, they have things that they're experiencing, and sometimes that doesn't necessarily get all the way up the chain, right? For whatever reason, right? It's just kind of a natural thing. It's just they're sometimes far away. So I think it's important to make sure that the message is clear as far as what the engagement model is to the salespeople, so that they understand what the mission is, and they understand that what's kind of okay and not okay, and it's okay to ask questions. It's okay to maybe even fail, right? In some cases but as long as you're following like a process and you have a plan and you're kind of following at least the general, like the playbook. Obviously, you want room for creativity. But you don't want to assume that you know it all, right? So when I look to hire people, and I try to make sure that I adhere to this as well, which is a learn it all versus a know it all type of culture, right? So that there's a lot of things you're going to learn, like we just don't know when you get into a sales cycle, right? And we talked about AI and how that's changing things so quickly, and like there's just a lot more unknowns. It feels like always around the corner, and things are moving. The velocity of just business in general is just moving so much faster that you can't possibly know it all anymore, right? So you have to make sure that you have the right mindset of learning it all and figuring it out together. And I think a certain level of transparency also works with not only the people that work in your organization under you, but also from a customer standpoint, right? And I think that that if you have that, you earn a bit more of the trust, and you'll hear from customers exactly what they're thinking and what they want, right? If you have that level of openness and willingness to hear it. So I would highly suggest, like any CRO or any sales leader, get closer to the customers, get closer to your people in the field, and make sure that you understand what they're experiencing, and then make sure that you communicate that to make those pivots that are necessary along the way that we don't even know what might be coming.
Such great advice, because let's boil it down. SMB sales is often run at scale. Much lower press the flesh, customer touch, if you will, or proximity to that customer. You're navigating really high volume and scale at speed. Enterprise shift is, what does your customer need? What are their needs? How do you meet them on their turf? How do you engage with them and build a relationship that can, start at a meaningful level for your organization in terms of scale, but then grow to something much larger? And that doesn't happen without, to your point, Paul, without having a relationship there and actually being in the field with your people, selling to them, being with the procurement folks, being with the decision makers in an organization, executives that are needing these solutions and these tools to be effective in what they're doing. Yeah, I think it's a great point. All right. One last fun one, actually. Let's do this. If you had a crystal ball for Atlassian or for the enterprise sales, what do you think is going to matter most in the next year or two?
I know the answer always ends up being AI, right? Everyone talks about that. So I'll answer it kind of in this way. With the capabilities that AI brings to the table, there's really no excuse to not really understand what's going on with your customer, what's going on in their industry, what challenges that companies like them typically face. So that I think there's going to be an expectation of customers that we're a lot more educated on what's going on. That we don't just show up and go, hey, tell me about your business. They don't have time for that, right? So, and we don't have an excuse anymore. Before it was hard, right? You had to go dig up an annual report and comb through it and figure out what's important and what's relevant for what you want to talk about. Now you can do it in seconds. And so I think that sales intelligence about how we approach our customers, there's going to be a higher level of expectation from our customers, and there should be. So I think as like sales leaders and sales people, we need to kind of up that level of game. And I think that the companies that invest in that sooner and grab onto that type of approach are going to be more successful, because you're going to understand the business problems that they're trying to solve for a lot faster and a lot more efficiently and effectively, and then you're going to be able to better position what solutions you offer. So I think the velocity is going to get faster, is what I think.
The effectiveness and the efficiency of salespeople will certainly be enhanced, but to your point, the expectation of the buyer will be that you're much more sophisticated or educated in terms of their needs and how your product can meet those needs with expediency. Fascinating conversation. Really appreciate the time today. I think we could go on and on. I really enjoy talking to you.
Thanks for having me, Paul. Appreciate it.